ladies and gentlemen, we've got a new update regarding the NATO situation with Donald Trump once again saying that he is considering pulling the United States out of NATO. There is a lot of analysis when it comes to something like this. This was something that Trump talked about, I believe, right after the election. I did a video on it, and you can see the source here is from the AP in the TV interview that aired on Sunday. I think that was the NBC interview that partially I reacted to yesterday. I didn't react to the part where he talked about NATO. Trump also said he would be open to reducing military aid to Ukraine and pulling the United States out of NATO. Those are two threats that have alarmed Ukraine, NATO allies, and many in the U.S. national security community. And so the first way you could look at this would be almost as like a fake threat to try and get the NATO countries to up their spending, which Donald Trump very, very easily could do, considering the United States basically controls NATO. The United States has so much of the leverage when it comes to NATO. Really, the only thing those European countries could do could be to threaten the United States because our military bases are there. And they could say you need to get your military bases out of here if you leave NATO. There could be other stipulations, but the United States is so dominant on a global level when it comes to the military. I think they'd probably still want to have a relationship with the United States. The European countries would, and I'm sure Trump would want to have a relationship with the European countries as well. But I think this is a little bit deeper than just a threat to try and get those NATO countries to up their defense spending, which is what Trump did his first term. And he was able to do it, of course, again, because the United States control so much leverage over those countries. The problem is when liberals are in control, they never exercise that leverage because they think it shows that they're bullies or, they're not in a good light. But Trump has no problem doing that. The other thing you could think about when it comes to NATO is it almost seems like NATO is turning into this almost globalist fraction within the world. And it's a liberal globalist fraction when you look at all the European countries, how liberal they are. There was a situation that just happened that was very interesting in Romania with an election there. And this right-wing guy, very right-wing guy, ended up winning, came out of nowhere, and they ended up annulling the election. The guy that won the first round of the election was very right-wing. He was more pro-Russia. And what their government found was that he somehow, I guess, had all these TikTok bots from Russia, and there was Russian interference. It's very similar to what they claimed in 2016, although this time they actually just said, no, the election doesn't count. It's like the Democrats in 2016 saying, no, Russia was involved. We have to redo the election. They do like a day-long investigation. And the person that they want to win, is more pro-Western, obviously. So they're like redoing an election because they deemed the person that won was not far enough in the West's pocket, not NATO enough, I guess. But the NATO situation is very interesting because there's clearly a drift from conservatives and their views of NATO and Democrats' views, and it's mainly because Europe and the influence there, Europe being very far left, mainly, although that is kind of changing a little bit, we would hope. The elections that recently happened certainly don't point to it, although, to be honest, if you take a look at the election there in the UK, it was pretty remarkable when you look at the popular vote versus the amount of power that the Labour Party got. And right now, the approval rating of the Labour Party is just horrible. So maybe things are changing a little bit, but this is very clear that a lot of Republicans in the United States don't like NATO for a number of reasons. And the biggest one is NATO has just turned into this liberal global movement. And, we can sit here and we can discuss and debate about NATO and expanding NATO. And I know NATO is going to say, well, you do it to make the world safer because you bring smaller countries in, then they can't be invaded. But obviously, there's the other side of that a lot of these people really can't comprehend. The idea is being on the other side of the agreement. You're not in the agreement. You're an adversary to the United States and to all these European countries, and they continue to expand their dominance across all of Europe. You're going to feel threatened by that. There's no doubt about it. So there's two sides to that coin. What will Trump end up doing when it comes to NATO? Who really knows? I mean, with the United States, the problem is we always go from Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat over and over again. So it's like Trump is in. He takes the United States out of the Paris climate agreement, which unfortunately a lot of Americans have no clue what that actually is. It sounds like it's a very nice agreement that helps the climate. No, it's just the United States subsidizing poor countries and giving them things to combat climate change. It's not the United States. There's no actual pledge within that agreement. It's just the United States giving poor countries money to try and, help their emissions. It has nothing to do, whether or not the United States is in the Paris Climate Accord is independent of our goals in regards to reducing the CO2 emissions. But it's like people think that, oh, it's the United States making a commitment. No, it's just the United States giving money to poor countries to help with their CO2 emissions. People don't really understand that. But Trump pulled the United States out of that, and then Biden puts it right back in because that's just the United States, right? Republican, Democrat, they just, I guess that is the checks and balances there. But the problem would be if Trump pulls the U.S. out of NATO, I'm sure Europe will just be like, oh, we'll just wait 3 years for the Democrat to come in. And then, I mean, the hope would be that Trump would win and then Vance would win and you could create some separation with NATO. And then maybe, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, this is a situation where it's going to be very hard to get out of NATO because of the relationship the United States has with those European countries. Hypothetically, you could very easily do it, but this would also be a situation that would make Trump, and look, I don't know if Trump really cares. I'm guessing Trump really doesn't care what liberals think, but they would immediately say he's in bed with Russia. This is exactly what Russia wanted. It completely destroys NATO. NATO just becomes the EU. I mean, listen, I think you would have to have the UK rejoin the EU at that point if the NATO becomes reduced to the United States pulling out. I really don't know what Canada would do. I guess they would stay in, but Canada would have their own relationship with the United States that's totally different and independent of the European countries. Because of the geographical location of Canada, we're going to have a special different relationship with them. And obviously Trump has also said some things about Canada and said that, you know what, we're giving Canada great trade deals. I think he said we're subsidizing them for something like $100 billion. With Mexico, it's way more. I think Mexico's a bigger problem. The border down south is the number one issue in dealing with that and tackling that. But we'll have to see. Trump definitely wants to do something in terms of trying to go more America first and create this identity within America that's not a constant apology, which it seems like liberals do when they travel overseas. It's like, we're sorry, we want to help you. It's like they always just want to give shit away from the United States, for lack of a better phrasing, and there's no actual fairness. And if there is fairness, that's viewed by liberals as the United States being too greedy. Like Trump pulling the United States out of NATO because he doesn't view it as a good agreement for the U.S. would be it's like an America first principle. It's, if this is not good for the United States, I mean, sure, there's other factors at play. Of course, there's going to be 100 different things you have to think about. It's not as simple as we're paying too much money for this. But a bigger problem with Article 5, especially with all these smaller countries joining, if one of them goes to war with Russia or whoever, that's an even bigger problem that could have been potentially avoided if those countries never join NATO. Maybe it becomes a regional conflict. Well, if one of those smaller Eastern European countries get invaded, that's a part of NATO. We get Article 5 and we get, you don't want to say a guarantee of World War III, but there's an extremely high % chance of World War III happening. So you could argue NATO, because of the expansion, makes it easier for us to go to World War III because of Article 5. And I understand people are like, well, if there's a small country that gets invaded in Europe, then, that's what should happen. And it's appeasement. This is Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler 2.0. And I just disagree on that. So that's just going to be a disagreement between me and whatever liberal person wants to say that any small European country being invaded is code for world. That's a part of NATO. We need to immediately have World War III because of that. That'll be just a disagreement between me and whoever wants to disagree with that. Because I think that's absurd, and that's the problem with letting all these smaller countries join. But then they're like, well, no, it's just a deterrent. They'll never go to World War III. Well, you really never know, especially if China and Russia keep getting closer and North Korea is already involved now. Imagine if Ukraine was part of. The thing is, I just think Russia's a lot, and we can debate it. Russia is a lot weaker than people think in terms of ground fighting. But obviously they do have the nukes, and that's the leverage play they're always going to have over the United States. And you might wonder, well, why would it be over the United States? The United States also has nukes. Yeah, but the United States, they're not the ones waging war. Russia is. So Russia's always going to have the leverage with nukes. The United States in the 21st century, we haven't really invaded another country. Now, we've done some really bad things in the Middle East that have been a total waste of time. And I want the United States just to get out of the Middle East and stay out. But that's another story for another day. And that would probably, my actual viewpoint on that, it's not worth it for me to say. But when it comes to something like this, with Trump trying to get out of NATO, or, I would imagine it's probably just a threat, and it's Trump. But Trump said multiple things with Mexico and Canada, where it seems like he's a lot more aggressive this time around, and it's very obvious as to why. He's got 4 years of being president under his belt. He's got relationships. He's got a brand new group of people that are totally different than 2016. We've not totally de-rhinoed, if you will, the Republican Party, but there's a less of a establishment Republican Romney McCain type fraction, which will enable Trump to be more aggressive on the policy that he wants to push. And he's already come out guns blazing, and he's doing things that, he's, not even in office yet, that he didn't do until 2-3 years in office back his first term. And his last year of the term was just totally mired in the pandemic. So that's also important to take into account as well. So Trump's being more aggressive. He wants NATO to pay more. Well, the problem with NATO is there's just this liberal influence, and is it really worth it to be involved in these Eastern European conflicts, especially with a lot of these smaller countries trying to join NATO and Ukraine trying to join NATO? They're not going to. I would imagine the peace deal that Trump ends up working out involves a clause that doesn't allow Ukraine to join NATO for 15-20 years. The dynamic between Russia and Ukraine is Russia has immense leverage over Ukraine because they have a stronger army, and Ukraine's standing there. And, this is another thing that the people, and I'm not trying to simp for Russia, but this is just, people have to understand this. There's people in America saying, well, you know what? Why, if Russia fires missiles, why can't Ukraine fire missiles? Well, Russia's firing their own missiles. It's a little bit different when the United States supplies missiles for Ukraine. You're involving other countries now. You're making it global. It's a bigger problem. If Ukraine wants to fire their own missiles back, if Russia fires missiles, that's fine. When they're supplied by the United States and France, that's a bigger problem. And it calls for more escalation. And so people have to understand it's just not that simple of they fire missiles, we fire missiles. Well, no, you're not firing your own missiles. You're firing missiles supplied by NATO, which is only going to drive Russia further away. And look, maybe it ends up working. Maybe you go to the negotiating table, and this is what I had originally said. I said they were doing this because they knew Trump was going to try and get a deal done, and they wanted to give Ukraine more leverage by saying NATO is behind Ukraine. We gave them missiles. We're ready to fight. We don't need to negotiate peace with you guys. We're not desperate. Whoever is more desperate in a negotiation always loses the negotiation. So they're trying to give Ukraine, NATO is right now a lifeline when it comes to potential negotiations involving Trump and involving Putin and Russia, but they're still, they have no leverage against Russia outside of NATO saying we're ready to go to World War III over Ukraine. But maybe Russia doesn't have a ton of leverage either. Look at what Russia's wasted in eastern Ukraine. I'm not saying Russia's fought a good war. They've really underperformed a lot of people's expectations with the amount of manpower that they've lost and the limited amount of area they've been able to conquer. So guys, that's just the current situation regarding NATO. Trump, I don't think he's going to back out of NATO. There's just a lot of moving parts. I mean, I guess technically it's possible. I think Republicans are starting to realize, and does this really matter in the sense of, it's going to hurt the United States. The fact that NATO is turned into kind of like this liberal European type military alliance. You could say, well, NATO's the US, and I think NATO is mainly the US. Without the US, it's basically just the EU and some other countries. But if the war is happening in Europe or in Eastern Europe or somewhere over there, the United States, in terms of what we want, is pretty much irrelevant. We just have to help the countries there. And really, when you look at the United States and how we're surrounded by water, is it good for us to be involved in an agreement in which we're always going to be playing the defense, right? Like we're always just trying to stop things. That's what the agreement is. That's what NATO is, and stop things in other countries, not our own, across the Atlantic Ocean. So I mean, it's something to think about, and also NATO, and this is something with the the European propaganda. They act like this is like this godsend agreement that must be in place. This agreement was not created for this reason. Agreement was created for the Soviet Union. And people say, well, they're trying to reform the Soviet Union. It's quite literally impossible. If you can't even get halfway through Ukraine, in the span of 2-3 years, Russia just doesn't have the technology to do it without hypersonic missiles or without further escalation, which obviously I don't think they would want, because it would really, I mean, it would destroy their own country if they decided to escalate to that situation against NATO, which you could point to as a positive and maybe a deterrent by NATO, which is if you're Russia, well, if we launch nukes, we're pretty much screwed. But the only reason you could argue this is happening is because of the NATO expansion. At least that's what Putin will say. It's also because they lost a lot of land after the Soviet Union collapsed, and you get Crimea back. And it is obvious, as we all realize, NATO and whether or not it's a deterrent is quite complicated in terms of Russia, and whether or not the expansion of NATO caused or helped cause the hostility and the invasion that Russia enacted into Europe, or was it possibly just their excuse to invade Ukraine? That's also another thing that has to be taken into account when it comes to this. But Trump, I think the overall point of Trump continuously saying this and having this viewpoint is he wants the United States to stop getting taken advantage of by the European countries, and he wants the United States, if we are going to stay in NATO, to be in control of NATO, considering our manpower, well, not the manpower, but our military and just the amount of weapons we have and the technological advantage we have, along with just how big our economy is and how massive of a player we are. The United States is really the one, even with a war in like Eastern Europe, because the liberal viewpoint, well, if it's happening over there, the European NATO countries should really have a big say over what happens with NATO and how we fund a potential country. I think Trump wants that power back into the US's hands, no matter where we're talking. This is just something that we're seeing more and more, at least the last few years, when it comes to Republicans being more isolationist as opposed to trying to interject in all of these conflicts and almost be the overseers of the world, which the United States has been for so long. And we'll have to see what Trump wants to do in terms of that. But I would imagine this is mainly to get a lot of these other NATO countries to up their defense spending. And if Trump really wants to, maybe say, you know what, if we spend, what does the United States spend over 4%? Maybe these other countries need to spend at least 3.5% to 4%, because I think it's only 2.5% right now. That's the agreement. You got to spend at least that. And a lot of the NATO countries, a lot of the smaller ones, weren't even spending that. But honestly, even something like that, does it really do anything if they decide to spend more on their I mean, NATO in and of itself, the existence of it and the threat that it poses, I guess, to some of these other countries like Russia, those countries upping their defense spending is only going to make NATO more of a threat. Which, I mean, you don't want to be taken advantage of if you're the United States, but it does, it makes NATO stronger, which you would think the Europeans would want. I mean, a lot of these countries, it's inexcusable. You have a military agreement with the United States. You think you'd be doing everything in your power to keep that agreement, whether it's spending 3% of your GDP, 4%, whatever it is. But a lot of these countries can't even spend that, and the liberal Americans just allow it. If you say anything bad, you're the bad person, you're the bully, you're the United States. You have to let these other countries freeload into your agreement, and if they get invaded, you must go and defend them. And then you've got all these massive countries sending troops to a certain country that could have easily been avoided with a regional conflict that's now turned into World War III because of Article 5. But look, maybe it's a deterrent. I agree. It can be a deterrent. And you're not going to have a situation with Nazi Germany picking off all the European countries, although that's basically impossible for Russia to do, as we're seeing them struggle in Ukraine. The only thing that Russia really has in terms of global power and global threat is the nuclear bombs, which is something that they always wave as a major threat, which is what they should do, because they understand that it is a huge threat no matter what. And I know a lot of liberals are saying, well, they never do it. That's a death to their own country. That's, you're putting some faith into that. But there is no right answer. There really isn't a right answer. It just comes down to a threat assessment. Either way, guys, it is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Links to that's always in the description.